Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the Museums and Race virtual conference. We are thrilled you could join us to continue discussions on how we can imagine a radical future. I am Dr. Carlisa Callwood, your host for this session. Museums and Race's collective work is designed to invite a more nuanced museum discourse, particularly around three pillars: oppression, identifying the complex and too often unacknowledged ways in which systemic structural norms influence decision-making so that cultural institutions present themselves in ways that are unacceptable and exclusionary to many; privilege, the pervasive assumptions of whiteness and wealth, which are counter to inclusion and diversity and perpetuate white cultural dominance; and intersectionality, understanding how race intersects with gender, social justice, class, and socioeconomic status. We are glad that you are all here, so let's get started. Slide is not advancing, there we go. Before we begin, we'd like to take a moment of reflection. We usually collaborate with local Indigenous communities to help develop a land acknowledgement specific to our conference location. This year, we are joined by many people from around the globe, so instead, we ask that you please take a moment to reflect on the history, social circumstances, and personal experiences that bring you here today. We ask you to consider whose ancestral home occupied where you now reside, what circumstances brought you to this moment, and how you carry your ancestors with you. These are the guidelines for today's participation. We ask everyone to be present. We remind you that this is a space to take risks respectfully, and we encourage everyone to use your head, heart, and gut to make space to learn something new and challenge existing paradigms. As a housekeeping note, please feel free to use the chat to share your thoughts, and the Q&A function is also available if you have any questions. We have someone from the Museums and Race team who will be moderating the chat and gathering the questions to share with the panelists at the end of their presentation. I will now turn the presentation over to Kate Quinn, who will moderate the discussion on the decolonization of Penn Museum's Africa collections. Kate?
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. We're really excited to share the work that we've been doing at the Penn Museum with you all to move the conversation forward with regard to decolonization efforts in encyclopedic museums. Thank you to Carlisa and the Museums and Race folks for allowing us this opportunity to share. I'm having some trouble sharing my screen. It's saying I can't do so well, another participant is doing it. So. Oh, here we go. There we go. So thank you again. We're really happy to be here with you all today. I would like to start off with some acknowledgements. First off, the Penn Museum respectfully acknowledges that our land, where the museum is located, is situated on Lenape-Hoking, which is the spiritual and ancestral homeland of the Unami Lenape people. We have the sign in the museum as soon as you walk in, and all of our participants are currently in offices and their homes, which are also in the same region where the Lenape have been for centuries. So today there's going to be four of us speaking to you. My name is Kate Quinn. I'm the Director of Exhibitions and Special Programs at the Penn Museum, and I was the project director on our Africa galleries. Dr. Monique Scott is the Director of Museum Studies at Bryn Mawr College, and she was a valued content advisor for our Africa galleries. Dr. Tukufu Zuberi is the Lazary Family Professor of Race Relations and the Professor of Sociology and Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. He served as the lead curator for these galleries. And finally, Jess Bicknell, who is our head of exhibitions and the lead interpretive planner for the Africa galleries at the Penn Museum. I want to start off by giving you some history about the museum itself and about the project and how it moved forward and the steps that we took to be able to bring it to you, well, to our visiting audiences. So first, I'd like to acknowledge the courage of leadership that it took to take the steps to move this work forward. The work that we did in many ways is radical, and in many ways it's not enough, and it's not done. But we leave it to be a huge leap for encyclopedic and anthropological museums to take in this time frame. And it's because of the deep commitment to rectifying historical wrongs, to transparency, and to the highest international musical standards that we were able to move forward. And really to acknowledge the unwavering support that we had from museum and university leadership to do this work. For many people, you may know that getting support to move forward with this kind of work is the hardest step to take. So we're very grateful for our folks at the museum at the university for allowing us to do so. So we set forth, this is the Penn Museum. The museum was established in 1897. It was meant to be an encyclopedic museum. It was built in colonial times. It is a product of colonialization, and we acknowledge that from the start. The collections number over just about 1 million objects in the collection, and most were acquired through archaeological expeditions around the world. Some were purchased, and you're going to hear more about the purchase of some of these objects and collecting practices that we incorporated into our galleries as folks move forward in the presentations today. The Penn Museum's mission is to transform understanding of the human experience. This is a new mission statement for us. We've been in the process of renovating our museum for the course of about 8 years now. This mission statement was one that we created in about 2014, I think it was established, and it is our driving principle. Every choice that we made about any of this gallery or any other galleries was based on the foundation of this mission statement, our guiding light. So we've created a new Penn Museum, and that museum renovation started in about 2012 with development in special exhibitions, new galleries, new public spaces. And in 2017, we opened our new Middle East galleries to the public. And in 2019, just in November, before we had to close the museum, we opened a new main entrance, which included a Sphinx gallery, and that's what you see in this photo here. We opened new galleries of Mexico and Central America, our new Africa galleries, and a new auditorium for programming. The image that you see here is of the opening day, which celebrated primarily the Africa galleries in Mexico and Central America. And so you see local community groups who came together to help us with those celebrations. We're going to talk about the Africa galleries, though, and the collections are the foundation of the galleries. And so here are some bullet points about the collection. I won't go through them in detail, but of note, the African collection at the Penn Museum is one of the largest and most notable collections of African art and art history in the world, and certainly in the country. It includes about 15,000 ethnographic, 5,000 archaeological, and approximately 45,000 more objects from the Egyptian from the country of Egypt. Most were obtained between 1891 and 1937. A huge portion of the collection was purchased. It wasn't excavated. It was purchased from dealers in London and in Germany. A fair amount comes from missionaries, and this is something that we do cover in the exhibition. And we have material from almost every country in Africa. There's a very large representation of cultures in the collection. The Africa galleries had been quite dated, we'll say. These galleries opened initially in around 1993. This is an image of a wedding that took place or a photography of a wedding that took place in the galleries at some point in the past, I think 10 years. But the galleries themselves were outdated. The galleries were highly used by school groups, however, and so we knew that there was a want for the information about the objects. The galleries were not well curated. We did not have a curator to work on researching the collection and in presenting stories in a way that was digestible to the general public for quite a long time. But we certainly knew there was a need for this material to be presented accessibly to a public. So in 2009, we started to think about what renovations to that gallery might look like. And one of the things that we were most interested in is what the public wanted to know. What do school groups need to learn about that our collection can support and that our expertise can move forward with? So through the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, we received a grant to create what we called a long-term, like a temporary exhibition that was focused on evaluation And what we did with this exhibition, which was called Imagine Africa with the Penn Museum, we installed a series of sections in an exhibition that covered a lot of the topics that you would see presented in many museums similar to ours with collections similar to ours. We asked the public, we showed a small display of topics such as fashion, we covered great kingdoms, we covered art history, spiritual practices, and we engaged in conversations with the public about what they liked, what did they resonate with, what did they think the stories were strongest, where were objects best situated for them. And we got a lot of feedback. Over the course of several years, we received over 60,000 responses. And these were meant to be a roadmap for the future. It wasn't that we were going to take the responses that we heard from the public and move forward in doing exactly what they had said to do, but that was going to be an opportunity for us to partner with a lot of expertise to move forward in creating new galleries that were informed by public opinion. So visitors mostly asked, who made these objects? Why were they created? Why are they here? How did they get to the Penn Museum, and why does this matter to me? They were most interested in how objects were created. They were very interested in the stories of colonialism and enslaved African people. They wanted to know more about healing practices and a lot about great kingdoms. So we took that information and we started to develop some ideas about how we could move forward with our galleries at the Penn Museum. In the same time, the Philadelphia Museum of Art was interested in borrowing some of our Africa collection to create an exhibition of their own, which opened in 2016, and it was called Look Again, Contemporary Perspectives of African Art. And you're going to hear from Dr. Monique Scott, who's going to speak more about the work that her students at Bryn Mawr College did to conduct some evaluations about how the public understood our collection in an art museum. What stories were they hearing about there, and what was their reaction to seeing the types of stories that were told through the PMA? So we took that information and we developed an advisory board. Dr. Tukufu Zuberi, so Tukufu led all of the content development and all of the curatorial work for the galleries, and he very smartly engaged in conversation and pulled in additional experts to help us navigate through these very complex stories that we were able to tell. And so here are some of the advisors that he pulled forward, one including Dr. Scott. Oh, wrong way. So when we started to look at what stories we could tell and what's the best way to move forward, we came up with, again, some of those guidelines that we had from the Imagine Africa galleries. And we want to make consistent connections with the continent. We wanted to talk about globalization, Africa's impact on the world, and tell the stories about how those objects that are now in our museum got there. Who made them? What was their journey? What was the object journey from Africa to Philadelphia? Why are they here? How are we sharing those stories? And we made a very concerted effort. And again, thanks to our leadership for allowing us to move forward with this, but to be as truthful and as transparent as possible with the collection. We're owning the story. We're owning that many of these collections were a product of colonial looting. We do have Benin bronzes in the collection that are from the Kingdom of Nigeria. Many of you may know that the British government in 1897 went into the Benin Kingdom in Nigeria and took all of the objects out of the Benin Kingdom, and they then burned the palace down. So this collection that we have is a product of colonialism. It is a product of looting, and these materials were stolen. And we do acknowledge that within the context of these galleries. We also talk about what it is that we're doing with this collection. We did have a choice to put the collection on display or to keep it in storage. We have engaged in conversations with many different entities in Africa, and we continue those conversations to find the best way forward with the collection. It may mean returning some objects. It may mean keeping the objects and engaging in staff exchanges and intellectual exchanges with institutions. Each person with whom we've spoken has a different idea about what collaboration and sharing of collections looks like. But we do have this statement at the gallery start that you can see and you can engage with when you're there, which acknowledges the collection's controversy. And this is the video that you see when you come into the gallery. And this is something I'm going to play for you. It's just over a minute long. It'll situate you into what it is that we were talking about and are talking about in those galleries.
European colonial domination devastated the African continent. Penn thought about Africa using this colonial mindset. The foundational objects of this collection were created in or taken out of Africa during the periods of enslavement and colonialism. As you circulate in these galleries, we invite you to consider how these objects were made, who made them, and how they came to be in front of you today. These galleries are designed to expand horizons and to deepen the conversation about African material culture, representation in Western museums, and the connection of this material culture to modern Africa and the African diaspora. The dark history of enslavement and colonialism doesn't stop us from telling stories that celebrate Africa's contribution to humanity.
So when you come into our galleries, one of the first experiences that you'll have, there are two separate entrances to the gallery, but if you come in through our east entrance, you're confronted with a very large sculpture. This sculpture was created by a Brazilian artist named Jorge dos Anjos, and Jorge's work focuses on candomblé, which is a spiritual practice, and he was very excited about and interested in our Nikizi figures and spiritual figures that are represented in the collection. We worked with several contemporary artists through this journey, and they really worked as visual interpreters for the galleries. Their art helps to interpret the stories of the collections. So this large piece is called a Wall of Memory for an Ancestral Palace. He speaks a bit about the practices, the spiritual practices of the candomblé, and also was inspired by the Benin Kingdom and the ancestral palace that was burnt down by the British in 1897. The second portion of the gallery, when you walk forward, you're going to see our section that is devoted to the Benin Kingdom. You'll hear more about this from Tukufu in just a bit. But you'll see that there is a large sculpture that's behind the case in the center image. That's another piece of contemporary art that was commissioned. Actually, it was commissioned by two artists. One is born in Senegal and one person from Philadelphia, and I'll show you a slide on that in just a moment. But as you walk through this gallery, you do enter into the Benin Kingdom. This letter here on the right-hand side is the archival evidence of the transition of materials from the Benin Kingdom to the Penn Museum. We have the actual document, and the document is on display for the public to see and to reckon with. It's completely transparent and showing our honest approach to how the objects got here and why they're here today. Tukufu will speak more on that in just a bit as well. We have another panel that talks about the Benin Kingdom, Benin in the West, and the sacred objects, and recognizing again the colonization of the Benin Kingdom, and that this museum the collection is there because of the product of colonialism. So these slides are just going to take you on a bit of a journey through the galleries. This is Musana Ali and Amadou Kansai, and they are the artists behind the piece called Presence of a Fundamental Absence. If you look closely at this installation, you're going to see a lot of found objects that are embedded into the walls of the museum, actually. And so they were very interested in the idea of collecting practices. And what does it mean to take something out of a country and bring it to another? What is that displacement about? And so their work focused on actually gathering objects, found objects in Senegal and in other places near their home in Senegal. And they brought about 12 suitcases full of objects to the museum, and they embedded them into the walls of the museum. One of the things that they also found very interesting, we'll say, when it comes to the process of storing objects in a museum is the practice of taking and creating accession numbers for objects, essentially in their mind and in many minds, stripping the identity away from the object and from the author and placing a number on it. So you'll see that there are several numbers, the AF numbers, that are embedded into their work. It's a commentary on collecting practices and policies of museums, predominantly in the West. The exhibition, the galleries move forward and focusing on spiritual and religious objects. We have a number of Ethiopian Coptic paintings. We have spiritual manuscripts, Muslim manuscripts and materials from Egypt that talk about the very diverse religious practices on the continent. It's one of our Nikizi figures that is also in that same case. We have a section of the gallery that focuses on the enslaved peoples of Africa. Now, our collection doesn't really have material that allow us to tell that story through objects in a robust way, but it is something that, of course, needs to be acknowledged. And Tukufu and the advisors, and I'm sure he'll speak more about this, decided to focus on the idea of exchange. How was Africa built? What happened to build up the continent of Africa, and how were things moved on and off the continent to build up currency? people, unfortunately, were one of those products. And so the exhibition talks about this and highlights some of those stories. We have a panel here that talks about and recognizing the violence that attributed to the building up of the continent and of areas around the world. It was one of the products of colonialism. As you move forward into the gallery, you go through a focus on design, and we talk about the exchange of ideas and of design from both Western places in the world to Africa and back and forth. And so what does that exchange look like? And what are the products of design and of art that come through the African continent? We have a case that focuses on textiles, which will be rotated quite regularly. We have a very large collection of textiles with a lot that will rotate through the years. And finally, as you come through the end of the exhibition, there's another piece that was commissioned, and it's a piece of fashion. It's a dress that was commissioned for the museum, focused or created by Brianna Moore and Emerson Ruffin. Brianna and Emerson were really interested in this ivory, which you can see at the base of the middle picture on your screen. From that ivory, they were inspired by the stories that are innate in the front of that piece, which talk about legacy and of ancestry. The dress itself shows representation of symbols that you can find through the years and that had inspired ancestors and inspired them today. So that's just a slight glimpse into what the galleries are all about. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to people who know much more about this and are much better equipped to speak to it. And I look forward to seeing you again later in the presentation. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Monique Scott. Monique?
Hi, hello. So thank you, Kate. And enormous thanks to this really fantastic and important thing that this Museums and Race movement and conference. I'm really honored and grateful to be part of this. And thank you for creating such this kind of productive and healing and generative space for us to come together. It's a breath of critical fresh air, I think, for us, and we all need a breath of fresh air right now. So I'm gonna because I am really thrilled to be in community with this particular community, I'm gonna share a little bit about how I came to this, how I came to studying ways of seeing Africa. And I am, as perhaps Kate mentioned, I'm an anthropologist that studies and works on representations of race and culture in museums. And more specifically, I've spent the past 20 years or so thinking about first from bioanthropological narratives, because I came out of a bioanthro PhD program, actually, but ranging from sort of evolutionary images to ethnographic images to images of African cultural production in or as art or artifact. And I did this through grad school and a postdoc, and then I worked at the American Museum of Natural History for 10 years as head of cultural education. You can see images from that museum there. And so now I'm teaching at Bryn Mawr College, but as you can imagine, I was really thrilled to get the invitation from Tukufu to be part of this really, I think, groundbreaking exhibition endeavor. So, in his radical visions. And then I think, anthropological and colonial images of Africa have consumed me in many ways, intellectually and personally, as I said. And I think, I was inspired yesterday what I felt and heard from Joni and from Janine to just acknowledge my own positionality as doing this type of scholarship as a Black woman, from then in my late 20s to now in my mid 40s. It is hard work, and I just want to put that out there. It's intellectually my driver, but it also can be quite painful at times. And certainly I encountered many emotions while doing some of the archival research at the Penn Museum. So I'm going to kick us off by not kick us off, but this next phase of the presentation by thinking of some broader issues of exhibiting Africa. And, you know, we've long been in a critical moment concerning the bestialization and demonization of the Black body of people of African descent. So I do think it's really important to think about where that comes from. And for me, I'm motivated to think how museums and anthropology itself help construct that idea, these racial hierarchies with Blackness on the bottom, and how museums and anthropology perhaps can help us deconstruct that idea. So next slide, please, Kate. So these two images represent in different ways instances of the history of the Penn Museum, and gives me an opportunity to think about the residues of this kind of pseudoscientific anti-Black racism that sits in spaces, that lies in museums today. And to think about what is the legacy of 19th century Penn Museum work, such as, you know, the Morton collection, the Samuel Morton collection at the Penn Museum, but also the legacy of early colonial excavations of Africa, the legacy of Black bodies on display. And actually, I mean, the image that you see on the right was actually in the Imagine Africa exhibit until I was at 2015, decontextualized, but you know, the ways that these images are both they're stains, they're residues. I think you can still feel them, and certainly audiences can feel kind of the history of anthropology, of these anthropological institutions when they visit museums or when they choose not to visit museums. And the image on the left really stuck with me, and it's something that I found for the first time when my students and I were doing research in the archives a few years ago. It was a really hard image, and it was really hard to shake, and you see how it's a very constructed image. And I think the feelings that it produced, you know, made me want to go deeper into it. And it didn't make it into this exhibition, but I was able to co-curate an exhibition with Meg Only at the ICA, where we could show this image, and it kind of helped, I think, to reactivate or change how it's activated, alchemizing it a little bit. Next slide, please. So returning more broadly, Black body as a spectacle. So many of you are familiar with these images and this history, and Roni brought the spectacle of Sarah Bartman powerfully and sensitively to the fore in the talk yesterday. But here I want to emphasize and think about this type of work as part of museums' race science. So these images, while spectacle, are still a part of legitimizing scientific doctrine. So these early bioanthropological narratives constructed through images in many ways created the visual regimes or rhetoric about Africa, which have contributed to and contribute to cultural and ontological understandings of race and Blackness, reasoning that informed and allowed for practices of slavery, and then continued to perpetuate forms of social dominance and material disenfranchisement, as the work of Jennifer Gifford Gonzalez has helped me articulate. Next slide, please. So I just going to show you a few images and close, and Kate has already shared with you these images from the Penn Museum. And you could see here kind of the many common that are present, the traditional ethnographic here, an image of a static, timeless, primitive Africa on display, and a timelessness seemingly of African people. And these early anthropological exhibits, although they had a life far beyond that early anthropological thinking in the late 19th century, they were characterized by these kind of object heavy cases. We have more, and a real disconnect between living, breathing, dynamic culture, and disconnect from humanity, ironically, given its anthropology. And of course, the emphasis on the natural world, which is underscored with these heavy earth tones. There's an overall heaviness, dark and dusty, these windows into like a very distant place, remote in geographic space and in time. Next slide, please. And I just want to locate this within the wider landscape in Philadelphia and note that this sense of a static Africa can happen in a variety of museums in similar and dissimilar ways. This isn't not only an anthropological problem, but in ethnographic museums, of course, but also art museums such as Creative Africa. I won't get into that research today, but thanks for mentioning it, Kate. And then the idiosyncratic collection of Albert Barnes here in Philadelphia. And a book should be written on this, and I hope to write it one day. And my last slide, lastly, so I just wanted to reiterate that after thinking about these issues of exhibiting Africa for so long, I was just thrilled to meet Tukufu and learn of his visionary approach. And thrilled that I was able to do some archival research there at the Penn Museum and ask how can collection archives uncover the colonial practices that produced ways of seeing Africa. And as you will see, and as you know, this was a curator who was not shying away from the tough issues. He's like, bring it on. So I was thrilled to work on this. And it was not easy in implementing these ideas, as Jessica will also speak to, but really grateful to be part of a project that could ask these difficult questions. Thank you.
So now we'll turn it over to Tukufu to give you some additional foundations into the fantastic work that he did in pulling together content and deciding what stories we would tell. Tukufu? You're muted. You need to unmute.
Good afternoon. I became interested in, am I good now? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Here, let me just go back to the debate. I became interested in the relationship between marginalized racial groups, populations, and nations, and how they were related to museums, probably with my first visit in 1986 to Africa, in which I had an opportunity to visit a museum there, and I had already been visiting museums in the US and their presentation of Africa. And that inequity kind of really, really provoked me to think about how the museums, especially these museums of history and culture, are very painful sites, as they are part of the kind of master projects of colonialism and maintaining the relationships that followed enslavement. You know, so I'm particularly interested in how do you change those narratives in museums, especially these great museums of the world, which are points of departure for so many of us across age groups. And I was especially interested in ways to find out how we can collaborate in these institutions. Let me just give you a quick way that my mind works with these objects. So if you look at this first slide here, you see the transition from the Benin Kingdom, and this is an image, it's a colorized etching from that period of time, I think from the 17th century. And then you get these individuals who are part of the punitive expedition against Benin's independence and against the Benin Kingdom and Empire. And they're sitting in the storage room of much of the art in Benin. And if you go to the next slide, you see that this kind of capture of the booty of war, these objects which will find their ways in Germany, find their way to London, find their way to Paris, find their way to the University of Pennsylvania, while at the same time the Oba in 1897 is finding his way to imprisonment in Calabar, another part of Nigeria at that time. Can we go to the next slide? And you get this kind of, here is how those materials looked in the palace. This is a photo that was taken in 1891 in the Oba's palace, compared to how these objects now find themselves thrown and scattered around the ground and taken with the people who see them more as a prize in 1897. So it loses even its sacred space within the context of the palace as a consequence of the conquering. If we go to the next slide, you begin to see how Penn is following this trajectory and involved in it, no matter how circumstantial, in looking at these objects with other things as just objects separated from the narrative that you could get from the people who are the makers of the objects, the people who are the celebrators of the users of these particular objects. And so if you go to the next one, you see the impossibility of imagining this particular altar with this image, which is now, preparing for people to visit the museum and see some of the objects. It has been rendered into a thing very much so because of its separation from the people, its separation from the historical context, and its separation from that colonial connection which bridges it coming from Africa to coming here. And so if you look in most of these spaces where African material culture is represented with a lack of appreciation of the social circumstances of the creation of the object and its situating itself in a particular museum, we come up with, I think, various kind of problematics about how do we engage with these spaces, which for the most part have been painful. So the museum space may have been a wonder in terms of efforts to create enlightenment, but they were painful in terms of what they meant to the people who were victimized by that imagery. And those people who were victimized by that imagery, by that institution, by that creation process existed in Africa, but accompanying these objects in the diaspora, or most so, the objects accompanied the creation of an African diaspora in these Americas. And somehow that has been separated as well. So all of these degrees of separation leave these objects as things that can be marveled at, but the history and the place of them is kind of lost in that process. If you look at this next slide, what you see here is a particular bracelet which was given to the museum some years ago by an individual named Mr. Roth, and this is a letter from his brother pursuing the interests of the museum in acquiring the object. Now, his brother was a Surgeon General in the British military, which was going to do this great damage and harm to the people of Benin. But here is the level that we're just trying to, in our redesign of these galleries, is to demystify how this object found its way there. Of course, the object is beautiful. Of course, the object entails craftsmanship, which shows the intellectual development of art and society in Benin. But it also tells a story about the relationship of this object to the University of Pennsylvania. And in that way, you see that it shouldn't be impossible to make this leap, that we should make this leap. And archives are one of the sites, one of the spaces we need to pursue in order to uncover the truths of these objects. Indeed, the objects need to be reimagined because they are, one, even if they go back to Africa, they have been separated and they have a history in that separation. Their return would be an occasion for considering how they got there and why they got there. If we go to the next slide. So, in my view, I just think we have these kinds of challenges, and these challenges are really what confront us in this effort to go forward. You know, can we actually establish collaborations with African cultural institutions that will facilitate reparations and better cultural circulation? There was an article that was or not an article, was a request by President Macron of France to Zuberi and Sarr to write an article about what France could do. And they came back with some suggestions about what the French government could do with those items which were owned by the French government. And they made that their purview. And I thought, you know, this is a very interesting piece, but I was quite frustrated with the entire project that they presented. Because, and if you want to understand this, there's an interview that Savoy did with the United Nations right before they wrote this article. And she said, you know, we did this, or right after they wrote this article, and she was responding to a question by the person who was interviewing her. And she said, you know, Sarr represented the African side of this. And me, I represented the European side of this. And I thought what was missing in this equation is someone from the diaspora who might have also had an interest in these objects. But only having that bifurcated understanding misses the point about these objects being in the diaspora and about these spaces having an imperial relationship, which was also connected to that which created this diaspora enslavement. And by leaving that out of the question, they missed the issue about what this cultural circulation could mean. Because look, a person in the African diaspora has the obvious question. If you're coming from things in the African diaspora, what about me? And you can't just take me and ship me somewhere. You have to ask about the question about who I am and my relationship to these objects. And it's beyond the issue of just who owns the object. It becomes a question of what is the real question we're talking about when we talk about culture, and how do we resolve these issues? And one of them is not to ask these questions. So we must ask these questions as we go forward. Do we possess the languages and the way to talk about the aesthetic vision of what these objects were in Africa and what they are to us today? What do they represent for us today? Are they something just to be fetishized, which is to take them away from their connection to the people, both the people in Africa and the people who were, as a consequence of this colonial adventure, which was mixed in with the enslavement adventure to disperse this material culture all over the world? And then can we produce the paradigm shifts? Because it is a big paradigm shift to go from what created these museums to repurpose their demonstration and providing information to the public. Can we repurpose them in a way which allows us to express a cultural fluency to not only understand and interpret these objects, but to understand and interpret these objects in a way which does not marginalize Africa and does not marginalize African people and does not marginalize the history of African people? And can African artifacts be properly understood within the current theoretical constructs of modern discussions? I'm really impressed by Sylvia Winter's a kind of expression of a need for a new humanism, the need for something that goes beyond the limited project of enlightenment, that goes beyond the limited project of the creation of Eurocentric educational institutions, and takes those institutions and the individuals affiliated with them to another space. And if we do that, what will we have accomplished? For me, the museum is a very important space. It is a space which comes into contact with more people than most music albums come into contact, more people than most films come into contact. And so while a lot may have been inspired by that little scene in Black Panther where the guy talks about the theft of the objects from Africa, much is inspired from the museum and in museums to other people and how they interpret what is going on in the world. And this is not only Africa, but definitely Africa has a particular space of being pushed down, and Africa needs to be elevated. And what about the African diaspora in this conversation? It is the African diaspora, after all, that is the human aspect of this particular project. This project of including Africa in the conversation about something that is going to be encyclopedic. I appreciate the encyclopedic aims, but I am terrified that we will somehow try to hold on to the bad ideas from the past as we move forward because of the tendency not to see the need for a radical transformation of the museum as a space. Thank you. Was I good on time there?
You were just fine. That's great. Thank you, Tukufu. So Jess Bicknell is our head of exhibitions and was the lead interpretive planner for this project. This content was incredibly complicated and one that was not an easy thing to move forward in creating language that was easily accessible to the general public and allowed for thought-provoking conversations, which was one of our goals. We wanted people talking in this gallery. I think she did a really great job, and she's going to talk you through the process of interpretation for the galleries, how it affected museum practices in some ways, and really affected changes to our style guide overall. So Jess.
Thank you. So I'll go quickly so that we can have a discussion, which there's a lot here to tackle. I just wanted to show a few examples of how these ideas that Tukufu and Monique and Kate had introduced ended up manifesting themselves within the gallery interpretation. So you see here this, the ivory bracelet from Benin and the archival letter we've been talking about very upfront in the gallery. If you go to the next slide, Kate, you'll see that this layered, complex approach is one we took with the gallery interpretation and also the design. We worked to make things as in the round as possible, acknowledging that a lot of these objects were really never meant to be on display in this way in a Western museum. So if you go to the next slide, and this complexity and the ideas of presenting more than one side to these stories, dismantling this traditional narrative, extended to a special set of labels that we made for the gallery. So some of these objects with a deeper story got these very long 3-part labels. This is 3 times longer than most of our labels in the museum. And that's purposeful so that we could tell these deeper stories. If you go to the next slide. We also, wherever we could, thanks to that archival research, we tried to identify the individual or individuals who made these objects. We put images of them, photographs where we had them. If you go to the next one, you'll see we also ended up, as Kate mentioned, changing the style guide as a result of these galleries, and that's something that's extended museum-wide now, moving forward for all our galleries. The deepest part of this is leading with the proper name for the object, so not some westernized version of the name, but you know, what is this object called by the source community who created it, making sure that that comes first. So you'll see just, this is one of our labels on the top left, on the lower left is from another institution. You'll just see the difference in interpretive hierarchy there. So if you go to the next one, All this archival research and necessary history couldn't just go on the label. So we have, I think, 7 interactive touchscreens in the gallery that house things like, if you go to the next one, Kate, there's an example. So again, this archival information, we've got here a journal from a wife of one of the anthropologists and museum curators who collected from Sierra Leone in the 1930s. There are other things within these touchscreens like contemporary interviews, more videos made by Tukufu. If you go to the next one, you'll see this is one of those images that Tukufu showed during his portion of the talk. Even these very painful, photos from the 30s through the 60s and even beyond from the institution, we felt it was important to just be as transparent and open as possible in this process. So they were included. If you go to the next one, thanks to Tukufu and the advisors, there was an insistence on making the large static maps in the galleries be the Gall-Peters projection instead of the Mercator projection. And this is something that was a little bit of a challenge for the design team, but ended up being really important and a key visual for the public. This map does not distort the sizes of the continent, so it actually shows the proper size of the African continent. And so I'm going to hand it back to Kate now.
Thanks, Jess. One of the goals, certainly for these galleries, we wanted to deepen the conversation about African material culture, about its representation in Western museums and connections to the diaspora. I'm known to say to team members and colleagues alike that I'm the head of, an exhibitions department, but I truly believe that exhibitions die on opening day. They're never going to do anything more for you unless you're able to activate them and keep talking about them and bring them to life. And that's what we've been doing through the process of the opening of these galleries. We've invited local community members to come in to create programs, essentially giving the museum over to them and to do with the galleries in the museum in collaboration with us, but certainly them taking the lead. So you're seeing some of these samples of some of these programs here on the slide. One of particular note is in the bottom right-hand corner. We have a program at the museum called the Global Guides Program, and what we do through that program is to hire refugees from countries around the world who are located now in Philadelphia, and they are trained to give tours of the galleries, but also to incorporate some of their own personal stories about objects and about their experiences as they feel comfortable into the interpretation of the galleries. So people can come in and have tours of the galleries from very first-person perspectives and people coming in to the museum. In many of our galleries, and this is also happening in the Africa galleries. Tukufu and Monique have been engaged in several panel discussions and in lectures, and Tukufu's given film premieres in the museum, again, all based on the idea of activating those galleries and making sure that the conversations continue. So that's something that the museum believes very strongly in, and this is just a sample of some of the programs we've done. As soon as we're able to get back into the museum and definitely in online programs, we're continuing those conversations and hope that you'll take a look at the work that we're doing online and at some point be able to visit us in the future. So with that, I want to thank Tukufu and Monique and Jess for contributing their time and for acknowledging the work that they did and that we all did collectively to bring these galleries to all of our public audiences. We're happy to take questions at this point.
Thank you all for a really great presentation. So much to process from that. We've had lots of questions coming through from our attendees. The first question is, you may have mentioned this, Kate, but when were the previous Penn Museum African galleries opened?
So I think, actually, I might see if Tukufu and Monique know this better than I do because of all the research they did. We've had representation of Africa in our galleries, I think, since we opened. And so the opening of the museum was actually before the building that we're in now exists. And it was, I think, in 1897, we had exhibitions of East African material in what is, I think now the Furness Library, the Arts Library on campus. Those collections were then moved over to this building, which was completed in 1899. And from there, there's been representation of African materials through the many, many decades that the museum's been in existence. The question about what stories we have told, I think, have gone along the lines of what was popular as far as storytelling in museum practice through the years. And that's to say that in the 90s, some of those images that you saw, we didn't have proper curation for the collection. And so they were just misrepresented. There were some organizational choices that were made back in the 90s that we know when I came into the museum 13 years ago, they just weren't the best choices as far as contemporary storytelling and international museological practice. So we were able to study that and to see what the public thought about what they saw of the existing galleries, and then to use that as fuel for making changes.
I had one small thing.
Yes,
So
please.
Africa has been at the center of the museum. There's never been a question about the centrality of Africa in the project of the museum. There's just been confusion on the part of the museum about Africa, whether Egypt is in Africa, whether Nubia is in Africa, whether Africa is civilized, or whether what you represent when you show these things about Africa, but Africa has been ever present there.
Thank you. The next question, one of the attendees wanted to know more about the exhibit you mentioned in the beginning, Kate, that was used to get feedback from the public.
So that exhibition, again, was funded by the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, and it was always meant to be an evaluation with the general public. And so the methods that we used to move forward in gathering perspectives from the public is that we had 5 series of focus groups where we invited the community to come in to do some deep dives into investigating the objects in the collection, the themes that we were thinking about at the time. We had whiteboards throughout the galleries where people were asked questions. We asked them what we missed in the development of the content. We asked them if there was anything more they would like to know. We asked them all sorts of questions, and we took photos and we documented all of those responses. We had digital surveys also within the exhibition, so people could, and that was more easily quantifiable information that we received from the public. We had timing and tracking surveys. We had that done 5 times during the first year that the exhibition was on, so we knew through that what people were drawn to and what they remembered about the experience after. And one of the biggest things that for me personally to take out of that, we hadn't done a survey that really gave us as robust information, but in looking at any one object, including reading the label, we got about 23 seconds on average of people's time and focus. And so that was our average. And after that, we did test the rest of the museum, and it was the average throughout, that people spend about 23 seconds looking at an object and reading the label. If we added any sort of multimedia, not multimedia, but an interactive, it could be a flip book, it could be, just anything where they had to have a tactile experience or multimedia, that holding power, it quadrupled. And we would have a lot more time where the public was engaged with that. So that's certainly something that you see incorporated into these new galleries, where we make sure that we have time to draw the public in, make sure the objects are focused in a way that you have to see them along your pathways, and that there are things to do while they're there. Just to keep that the holding power there for the public. So we had all of those things. I think we had also, you could leave a message with us for people who weren't comfortable writing on the whiteboards. We had an advisory board who helped us to understand that not everyone may be comfortable writing on the board publicly. So we had leave a note kind of things where they could write just a private message and leave it in a box in the galleries. Yeah, and so all of that over the course of and then we had an online survey that was outside, that was just on the web too. So you had the opportunity to contribute your feedback in the gallery space, and then after you left, if you had something more to say, you could do that too. So altogether, we had about 60,000 responses within the course of the 5 years that gallery is at, the most robust being at the first year. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, great, thank you. So touching on what Tukufu just mentioned in his previous response, there was a question on whether the frequent use of the term Africa in the exhibition contributes to a general misconception that Africa is a single country rather than a continent. with many and varied cultures, countries, and specific cultural groups within those countries. Do you refer also to the individual countries of people who were the creators of the specific artifacts in the exhibition? Do you provide cultural context for those works for each of the specific groups of creators? So that was something that came up during the chat.
Before I pulled up a label so you can.
Yeah, so yeah, that's absolutely what we want to do, but how do you do that? So, you know, we're on the other side of the answer to that question. And on the other side to the answer of that question is to give that detail. But you have to ask the question, well, where did this object come from? And why did it come from there? And, you know, sometimes people will get confused and they want you to just talk about an object from Benin and to just have a conversation about Nigeria writ large. Well, Nigeria didn't exist as a nation when these objects were taken from the Benin Kingdom. Not to say that having a conversation about Nigeria is not important, but to understand the specificity of the object is to go down even a level deeper. So it's not just a question about the 54 African nations. You're talking about a historical trajectory into the past, and you want to kind of discuss that. And the reason we've been saying Africa is because we've been talking about the exhibit overall. But I think if you go and you look at any particular one of these objects, you'll see us drilling down. The tendency to think of Africa as a complexity sometimes has led people to an illusion that somehow you cannot talk about that specificity without comparing different places in Africa. And I take just the opposite view, that in fact, you cannot understand that particularity of any particular space in Africa without being able to compare it to other spaces in Africa and other spaces outside of Africa as well. So when we talk about the Benin Kingdom, for example, we specifically refer to that event. What happened? How did that object come from there? And I think this is the best way to do that because you can cut through some of the illusions about why and how in terms of the objects, but you can also begin to unfold the story in telling that, to talk about either the beauty, the craftsmanship, or where we can go with understanding this and how it helps us understand ourselves and other people and difference.
Great, thank you. So several of the attendees mentioned they love the transparency around the way the museum acquired the objects. So this is kind of a multi-pronged question. How many objects from the African collections have been returned to native lands? If no, are there plans to return any? And also, how is the museum addressing the ideas and process of potentially returning these stolen items, and have visitors brought this up?
Tukufu, do you want to go? Go ahead.
So for me, this is a big question. And it is not simply give the items back to Africa. I know that sounds like the right thing. Just give it back, let them figure it out, blah, blah, blah. Give the items to Nigeria. But most people who are saying that haven't drilled down to what does that actually mean? Where do you actually give it to? And why are you giving it? And what is the connection? Again, I'll remind you of these objects to the Africans in the diaspora. Again, it is problematic that people have forgotten about the African diaspora in this conversation. There is an intimate relationship to understanding the place of these objects and their displacement with understanding the displacement of African people. These things didn't just pop up magically and get created by Martians, like the pyramids weren't created by Martians. These things were created by people, by African people. At the same time of their creation or dispersion, Africans were either enslaved or colonized. Now, how do you break that mental thing while considering the placement of these objects? And for me, it's important to discuss this cultural circulation. But I don't want to do it on the unequal basis of just saying we have these objects and we give them back. But if we're going to talk about cultural circulation, can we talk about also the circulation of objects from Britain, I mean, why don't we bring the Queen's crown and circulate that around Africa and let it sit there? Just pull it right off of her head, take it to some African countries and put it on display and let people line up to see the Queen's crown. I mean, they've done that with African objects. They've done that with African objects from Cairo to Timbuktu. So why don't we consider a way of rethinking about this whole paradigm of what museums are about? And again, it's a simple answer to just say, give it back. That's like the answer of send the Africans back. The question of ownership, the question of provenance is a complex question, which we need to confront. Also, imagine this: a king could give someone a gift. An African could sell someone an object. I'm saying that being fully aware of the inequality that existed in Angola, the inequality that existed in Nigeria, the inequality that existed everywhere in the world as these objects were circulated. But that we need to have a real conversation about that. And the real conversation doesn't just get answered by saying, let's give Africa what's Africa. Well, things don't work that easily. And I'm just not the person who is just a property person, who is just a thing person. I think that leads to what has been known as a fetish. And this fetishizing of African objects is a problem. We need to reconnect Africa with its objects. And to do that is not as easily as talking just about Africa. You need to talk about Africa and its African diaspora, both its diaspora of things and people.
One thing I'll say about the institution, the University of Pennsylvania was one of the authors of the UNESCO Convention of 1970, and specifically the Pennsylvania Declaration is about the University of Pennsylvania Museum. That declaration talks about and makes a declaration that this museum and other museums should not be purchasing or collecting any art that does not have proper provenience, where the information about the object is not documented. If you don't have the place of origin, the legality of export and associated data with it, it should not be acquired. And that has been also expanded out then into just general collecting practices. It originally started with antiquities and with the idea of archaeology, but now it applies to all collections. And it's something that's been brought on most museums around the world I think most museums follow it, period, because it is the UNESCO Convention that talks about ensuring that you've got the proper provenience for objects. That started with this museum. We believe in making sure there's proper documentation and that there's proper ways to engage in conversation with local governments. And we've done that with every country with whom we've worked. So with regard to the African collections, no, nothing yet has been asked for to be returned. That's to say that doesn't mean it's not going to happen. We fully believe and expect that it would. When Tukufu went out into various countries in Africa to do his film work, he also engaged in conversation with the Oba, members of the court of the Oba in the Benin Kingdom. A nephew of the Oba in the Benin Kingdom is one of the trustees of the university and worked very closely with us on a lot of these conversations about our collections, about what it means to hold those collections in our museum and what it means for those people, individuals, governments, and families in countries in Africa who may want them back, or what does that mean? As Tukufu was saying, how do we share these collections? So we have engaged in conversations very specifically, and we have MOUs, memorandums of understanding, with the Oba and the Kingdom, with the National Commission for Museums and Monuments in Nigeria, with the Benin City National Museum, the National Museum of Nigeria, and the Museum of Black Civilizations, and a few others. So we're expanding our conversations not just to be with the government or with the kingdom, but also with museums and with individuals. The conversation about who you return these objects to is incredibly complicated, but it's not one that we're eschewing. We are certainly taking that seriously, and we're really looking forward to see where these conversations go and what's the best thing for everyone involved and for the objects. And so we don't know yet, but the conversations continue. Go ahead, Tukufu.
And so I just want to say, so, you know, I went to and have held a number of conversations with curators and directors of African museums about this question. And we are engaged, I would like to say, we are engaged in a conversation with them about what to do and how do we collaborate in a better way to talk and discuss this circulation of African culture. And I asked them before we had the galleries put up, should we do this? How do we do this? How do we talk about this? And how do we engage in a process which we can find some resolution? And the reason I say that it's a complex issue is because that's what they told me. They said it's not as simple as just asking that question, because we've done that. And we're now at another level of discussing the kinds of collaborations that we'll have. I tried to document having this conversation with people in the short documentary we made about putting the galleries together. So look forward to that video as well.
Great, thank you both. This next question is for Monique. What are some ways you were challenged or struggled both intellectually and spiritually with anthropology as a discipline based on its foundations? How did you resist and stay aware of insidious colonial and racist epistemologies of the discipline while still achieving your academic endeavors?
Oh, Carla, I saw this question. How much time do you have? I think we are almost out of time. My goodness, this is also why I'm glad we have this forum here today and through Museums and Race, because yes, it's really hard. I am motivated by my passion for the topic. I am motivated for the fact that I do actually love museums, and I love, I've had a tough relationship with some museums, but I also love them and believe in them, and I think it's that passion, really, that's the word I'm going to use, to just keep doing it. That doesn't mean I haven't there are projects I have chosen not to do. I also, I think that when I made a shift from the American Museum of Natural History, where I'd been since I was in college, 93, I'd been there for almost 20 years working in different roles and through grad school, that making that shift was healing from the Natural History Museum into teaching and in doing work at the Penn Museum. I will continue to work with natural history museums, but I think that somehow having like a foot in teaching, and I love teaching, and in this work, the painful, hard work of shifting institutions, for lack of a better word, has helped me. But, I also need a community of Black people and Black women. And, we have formed like a really good community. We've had like salons in Philadelphia of like people that are working in Black arts and museums. And we talk and we laugh and we heal each other. So, there's no easy answer. I mean, it's a journey, but I'm proud to be on this journey, but not an easy answer.
Well, thank you for sharing what you did. So next question, I want to get Jess in on some of the fun. Jess, there was a question on the storytelling effectiveness of longer labels in particular, and how visitors engaged with those. And did you have any tips on engagement for deeper stories through text panels?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's one that we were very aware of when we were making those longer labels. Usually, our limit is 50 words. So we just felt like it was really important. We tried to make sure that those are happening at discrete moments. So they're actually forget the exact number, but there's maybe 7 of them as you go through the galleries of these longer labels, so you're not overwhelmed with text everywhere. We made sure that we still were breaking it up into digestible chunks for people. And yeah, we are still, you know, we're not in the museum now, of course, and we're awaiting the opportunity to finish our summative evaluation. So hopefully I'll have more information, you know, hard data about how visitors are engaging with these labels in the near future.
Carlosa, you're muted.
There we go. Shifting to interpretation by staff, volunteers, or docents, how do you train or prepare them to engage in these conversations with your visitors, or even to have these difficult questions from your visitors? Similarly, how do you train them to have to talk about difficult topics with younger audiences? And what challenges have you faced in essentially having to oftentimes re-educate your staff, docents, and volunteers for this type of engagement?
We have a really strong learning programs and public engagement department at the museum. And I will say, through the history, my time anyway, at the Penn Museum, we've never stepped away from diving in headfirst into really controversial topics. So because of that, our teams in education are incredibly well trained themselves in how to train other people to engage in difficult discussions. We talked about destruction of cultural heritage throughout the museum and very sensitive issues that come up with storytelling about Syria and Iraq. We've had conversations about a collection that we have of human crania that was used to create the foundation of race and racism and the Morton collection. We've had opportunities for a lot of very sensitive topics to be presented to our publics. We do so very carefully, and we do so with a lot of training. And it's our own staff, for the most part, who do the training. Tukufu for the Africa galleries certainly provided training to many, many volunteers and docents, paid staff members at the museum in what the exhibition's all about. How are the galleries' stories told, what they could highlight, what they should highlight, so that they have that strong background information in order to create their tours. So I think it's a very good question. And it's one that I would say that from our own perspective, is one that our staff has been constantly trained in sensitivity work and in empathy, really, to be able to move forward with these conversations. I'm not sure if I'm giving as much detail, but if anyone wants to email, I can put you in touch with the right people to answer that question more deeply.
Can I say one thing?
Please.
You know, the thing I love about filmmaking and museum curation is they require teams of people. And one of the things that has to happen with the team is everybody has to get on the same page. And that changes your ideas if you have a vision, but it also changes the people's ideas. And there was one exchange that I had in one of our meetings of trying to convey some of the shifts that we were making with these new galleries. And one individual, and what he said, and it was really a brilliant comment, is how do you expect us to say some of this stuff? This is not what we've been saying, and it's not easy to say that. Mm-hmm. And my response to him, it sounds kind of cold, but I think it was real, was that is really what we came to do, is to disrupt space. So you're on the front line of the disruption, even though it's not like an earthquake, everything is in place, but what you need to do is change the way people are thinking. And the way that you do that is important, because that is education at this moment. At this moment is not simply a repetition of what has come before. It's a statement of something that is a new, fresh perspective on where we can go. And I think that the people who work at the museum were open to this change. And I think this was one of the fundamental first steps, is you have to have groups of people who are open to changing their view, and therefore can help make the project work. And what really makes these galleries work is having these docents, having the people who designed certain aspects of it willing to discuss it with you, from discussing the colors that will be used, and having a conversation which kind of uses this information that you've collected on turning a critical eye to the presentation of the objects, the presentation of the material culture, and being open to learning a different view and a different way of talking about this. And I think that was key, is first having this openness and establishing that that's what needed to be done.
Great. So can the Penn Museum staff share how this work has changed their personal ways of thinking and or approaches to exhibit development and presentation? And have you seen that this approach has been broadly accepted at your institution?
I can jump in, but I think Jess is probably best suited to answer this. So as she's getting her video on, I'll tell you that the Penn Museum and the University of Pennsylvania overall is very team driven in how we come together with our ideas for creating galleries and exhibitions and programs alike. And there were a lot of comments that came through, and we did at the start receive some pushback about these galleries and about the approach that we were taking, mainly in the form of, if we focus on the story of decolonization and we talk about the object stories and focus energy on how the objects got to the museum, we were taking away an opportunity to go deep into the cultural history of the objects and into some of the cultures themselves, that we're not devoting as much time and space to that. And that is true. That is a decision that we collectively made in order to highlight the decolonization story. We have to tell you why these objects were here. We want to acknowledge the wrongdoing throughout history. And that was an active choice, and it wasn't one that was met with open arms, I will say, internally at the start. And so we, again, had been working on this project. I started on Imagine Africa in 2009, and then these fine folks have come on board along the way as we've been working with many, many experts until Tukufu's grand vision comes forward and how to pull all of this great data together into something that we believe is the best choice to move forward with. So because we've been talking about it for such a long time, because we were moving forward and gaining acceptance and just support about the ideas overall, I think we were better able then to get some strong feedback into our own practices for creating exhibitions, for choosing the hierarchy of language that goes onto the labels, for choosing the Gauls Peter projection because it is not Western. It is one that shows the true size of the continents. So being more truthful in our approach, I think, was something that certainly came through the long-term development of this gallery and many others along the way. So I think that they have informed each other, but certainly so much happened with these galleries that are affecting the practice of the museum overall. Jess, would you say something different or more about that?
No, I think that covers it. The one thing I wanted to say is, as an interpreter, you know, I've been trained to make things simple and straightforward for the visitor so that people can take away as much as possible. And these galleries really challenged that in a good way. I think working really closely with Tukufu and the rest of the advisory board, you know, not everything is, it should be simple. That's part of the message here, is that these are complicated stories and histories, and you're not meant to take away one neat message. So that's definitely carried forward.
Thank you. So we are just about time, but I will ask our panelists and presenters if you do have any additional resources for folks to check out, if you can use this time to type those into the chat box for folks to review, and we can post those as well. We would like to thank you to our panel for this great discussion. And thank you also to our attendees for the really thoughtful questions that have been coming in. As a reminder, our second session today on teaching against oppression and exclusion in museums will be held at 2 p.m., followed by a virtual happy hour and poster session at 5. Don't worry if you aren't able to tune in. All of our sessions, including this one from this and the rest from this week, are being recorded and will be posted later. We deeply appreciate everyone and your support. Thank you to everyone who has donated to the Museum and Race program. We are proud to share that donations collected will support the volunteers of the Museum and Race organization, as it is completely volunteer run, and we will also be able to support the Museum Workers Relief Fund. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you all at the next session. Have a great day.
Thanks, Carlissa. It was great.
Thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.